Highlander, or Orin and Skull Alone, by Jonah Namzoff. Read to you by Ethan Sabatella. The author has put in place a trigger warning for body horror and gore/violence galore, but most of it's supposed to be charming. It was nearly dusk when the leaves began to change. Winter had begun, and the mists that blanketed the Monar Highlands had thickened into a snowfall that painted the hills. Only the trees, decorated in what few pale leaves had managed to endure the rising winds, and the occasional gray streak of standing stone broke the silence of white. But as Orin and Skull neared home, the solemn palette changed. Trees had their crowns here, glowing with faint reds and oranges. The pines were healthy with sap. The snow cover was lighter, and fallen leaves dusted the ground beneath fiery oaks. Color blended into the landscape from Duncalwood. Orin scanned the sky. "Let me know when you're ready to admit you got tricked again," Skull said with an amused growl. "It's a miracle they were even still here. They're not coming back." "I think they are." He shot her a worried glance. "They seem nice." "So does every living thing you lay eyes on," she replied, but turned her eyes expectantly to the sky all the same. Orin dismounted his shivering horse, boots crunching as he touched down. He unclasped his heavy cloak, a veritable quilt of monster hides after his adventures with Turkiaha, and slung it across the beast's back as they trudged forward. "Sorry, Galantine. Almost there." The dark stallion gave him a piteous look and let out a pent-up breath, eyes following the icy mist as it dispersed into the air. His piecemeal armor jingled softly as his quivering limbs felt through the snow. Skull had no trouble staying warm. They had both felt something new since Orin drank the blood of the first hound, but Skull was more in tune with ancient magics than he. Blue-gray smoke wafted up from either side of her jaws, fed by some unknowable fire warming her belly. She coughed occasionally, provoking a renewed burst of smoke and scouring a few rogue embers across the ground. Neither was used to the change, but both agreed it was welcome, given the cold. A few moments passed before Skull growled sheepishly. "Damn. Any chance you won't look up for a few minutes?" Orin turned back to the horizon to see two vague blue specks approaching, lit from behind by the sun as it began to retreat behind the hills. He smiled down at the wolf. "Our friends are back." Skull gave a rasping bark somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Only because I kept you from paying up front." Orin shrugged. "Probably. Thanks." The figures drew close enough to reveal themselves, wings flapping at a frantic pace as they fought to hold themselves aloft in the thin, cold air. Orin held out an arm as the magpie swooped in toward the three travelers, and each accepted its perch, one landing seconds before the other, and cocking its head inquisitively to the side. "They know. We told," it chirped. The other leaned in behind its mate. "Cold here. You promised Mears?" "Took your time," Skull said. Orin gave her a sideways glance, and she dug her nose into the swollen pouch dangling from her neck. Her jaws snapped twice, and she reluctantly tossed 2 silver coins out onto the sea of snow. "Very kind, very kind," the first bird replied, and immediately fluttered down to collect its prize. It admired its reflection in the polished metal, shifting its footing every few seconds to avoid the frigid surface. Skull padded past them silently. "You're both very beautiful," Orin called behind him as they pressed on. The crumbling outer wall of the dune came into view as they crested a small ridge, a shattered pile of stones that lazily circled the ruins of the town's outskirts. Wooden stakes jutted out of the earth in places, keeping vigil over the site. And Orin passed the charred husks of homes burned from the inside out and long since abandoned. Among the wreckage sagged dismantled high tents, and torn banners bearing the crest of the Grashar Kahante, evidence of past sieges left behind as a memorial and perhaps a warning. Orin let his gaze linger on a black piece of wood that might have once been a door. A child's stick figure carving stretched across it, the grooves filled with soot and snow. Skull salvaged a small iron arrowhead from the wreckage and trotted back to his side, dropping the trinket into her pouch, with a soft clink as it struck coin. I smell the feast now, she said with a nudge. They're pulling out all the stops for the conquering heroes. The faint scent of charcoal wafted toward Orin as he imagined the Hearthmasters cooking, and his mouth began to water despite himself. Wordlessly, they quickened their pace. Beyond a few copses of red-tipped trees, the inner wall of Dun Calwood loomed above the ruins. An imposing array of blackened wooden stakes stretched into the sky, rooted to a base of horse-sized stones where the earth had been carved out and pushed in toward the village to form a barrier. A bridge of packed earth guided the well-worn path to the gates, locked and chained between two monolithic standing stones rising from the carefully worked ground. Rough lines of ogham snaked down their sides like lightning. The tops of the Morning Orchard's ancient apple trees looked like tongues of fire cresting over the wall, rustling in the quiet wind, and beyond it all, wreathed in layers of falling snow, stood three great cairns that formed the Dun's northeastern wall, each larger than any tower Orin had seen before or since. Silvery water still worked its way down the central megalith of great piled stones. Unaffected by the cold, winter itself seemed to recede before the autumnal warmth of the Dun. A watchtower stood at either end of the wall, and Orin thought he saw movement within them. He couldn't make out any faces, but Skull gave a bark in greetings, and a figure began rushing down the rough-shod wooden stairs toward the gates. Orin patted Galantine's side encouragingly and urged him forward as the chains rattled to the ground and the massive charred doors swung open. A cheer rose to meet them, and Orin blinked as he took in the sight and smell of home. A throng of hunters had gathered at the entrance. They stood at the sides of the path, some saluting with weapons, others simply smiling and scratching the wolves that crouched at their sides. Still more hurried behind them, and at their helm was Aithne, walking toward Orin with brisk purpose and a knowing smirk. Red woad dripped down one side of her face, as though from a wound on her forehead, and her equally bright red braids burned against the half-muted cloak wrapped around her shoulders. Orin stepped forward to meet her, and the two clasped hands firmly. "What do you know?" she said. "The hero returns." "It's good to see you. I forgot. Well, I missed you all," he said softly. Yeah, enough. We know you're just here for the food, Skull." She gave the wolf a curt nod, who reciprocated, though her mischievous gaze was fixed on the creature at the huntress's side. Aithne's black-furred companion curled around her to face the newcomers, muscles rippling as he wounded the ground with his claws. "Good to see you, Hati. Or is it Lord Irontooth now?" Skull crouched low to the dirt with mock defense. The black wolf's eyes narrowed. "Sister." Aithne patted the beast back twice. Whether to encourage or diffuse his hostility, Orin could not say. His lips curled into something resembling a grin, revealing the dark iron spikes for which he was known, set in the sockets of missing teeth that had broken off deep in the flesh of his prey. Orin had seen them flay Spriggans like whittling knives, but Skull didn't seem impressed. She coughed up an ember, at which Hati almost recoiled, and a sly chuckle rose from deep in her throat. "All right, you two can play later." Aithne pulled Hati back to her side. "Let's get some food before Orin drowns us all in drool. And don't eat too much." She gave Orin a wink and clasped a hand on his shoulder, guiding him towards the feast. "Because you and me are sparring tonight. Anyone care to take his horse?" A young ranger emerged obediently from the crowd and led Galantine inside toward the garden, whispering to him amiably as she went. The hunters passed the stone broch that marked the center of town, weaving along the path beyond the orchard, and the fragrant homes of druids until Timber Hall revealed itself. It was a proud wooden structure, of humble proportions, but deceptively complex. Its steep roof jutted out of the stone of the cairn behind it, like the prow of a ship, and supports covered in children's artwork followed the length of the building as it stretched to either side. Before it was a circle where gatherings took place, a great slab of stone flush with the ground, inscribed with a spiraling groove that bore sentences in an indecipherably ancient form of the ogham the Highland Picts knew. It was obscured, at the moment, by a huge table made from the trunk of a felled tree and laden to the point of overflowing with food. Orin marveled at roast meats flecked with flavorful herbs, fruits and berries spilling over the edges of crude stone bowls fat gray fish and warm bread ready to be broken. Skull smiled up at him as comfort spread across his face. I haven't seen you like this in months. Is Dressed really that much better than you? Of course, he replied, still awestruck. I still think your cooking's at least on par, but this sure beats Seamus's eggs. Orin turned to look for Dressed, and he found the Hearthmaster a little ways off, tending to a string of colorful salmon hanging from a spit. He stoked the fire with a thrust from his fork, for good measure, and turned to see Orin's approach. Hearthmaster, Orin called. The half-orc grinned wide, sending his sharply curved tusks even further toward the sky. He picked his portly form up to his feet. He stuck the fork in a particularly large salmon and extended his arms for a bone-crushing hug. Orin almost regretted accepting it as a wave of green lifted him off his feet and threatened to suffocate him. I killed a dire elk for you, the gruff voice said. He deposited the gasping Orin on his feet and gave the fire another quick poke. And I got this to show for it. The cook raised his heavily muscled arm and pointed to the sea of scars and burn marks that adorned it. Most, Orin knew, the result of heroic culinary feats. He laughed, his belly shaking, and took a seat by the spit. How do the hounds like your cooking? I think they like it very much, Orin replied, except for the previous cook. He doesn't like me much at all. Ha! Dress licked a bit of fish oil from his fingers. One day, he'll get over it, and ask you to teach him a thing or two. Listen. He held out a bit of bread, which Orin took. I'd keep you here all evening if I could. None of these other hunters are cooks worth their salt, but Wayland's been waiting to talk to you. Don't tell anyone I gave you that, and don't let anyone see you eating it. The feast hasn't started yet. He tossed a fish head to Skull, who gratefully accepted, her gaze darting around jealously in case of witnesses to her crime. Orin shoved the bread in his mouth. The taste of winter bittercress asserted itself over the warm dough, and he made a note to remind Aya that it was in season. I'd love to help any time if you need it, he said between bites. Chief Wayland was easy to spot. He sat cross-legged atop a high stone set between Timber Hall and the table, one arm braced against the feathered great spear at his side. His companion, Darelai, laid on the other, her aged white fur graced with sigils in woad, testaments to her strength and her grasp of wild magics. The chief's dark braids and short, straight beard wavered slightly in the wind, and though he smiled down at his clan, Orin noted his eyes were still watchful, turning from the celebration to the dun's gates as they drew closed. Only when the chains slid into place did he take notice of Orin and Skull's approach. He hailed them, said something to Darelai, and slipped off the rock onto the ground. The villagers quieted as he approached Orin in the center of the square. A little bird tells me we have a hound of Hulin in our midst. His voice was deep and measured, tinged with the same hidden note of sadness that colored his gaze. Was it not just yesterday I was telling you stories about them? He drew up to Orin and bent to meet his eyes, and the two clasped each other's shoulders as their brows met in a warrior's greeting. A few hunters let out a mild cheer. It's only been a few months, Orin whispered, laughing softly. You don't have to tell the whole clan. Welland's eyes opened, and he gave the boy's shoulder a paternal squeeze. Welcome home. Well? The chief said loudly, gesturing to the feast. Since when do you show restraint? Carry on. An unfettered cheer rose from the crowd, and hunters rushed to claim a place by the table, shoving wolves and men alike in the scramble. Wayland beckoned for Orin to join him atop the rock, as Skull slipped into the crowd. The swelling sounds of crude woodwinds reached Orin's ears as he approached and took a seat on the opposite side of the chief. It was a jaunty tune, but nothing as moving as Magonia's lute. He let his legs dangle off the side of the rock and inhaled deeply as a sense of the feast rose toward him. I received your other messages as well, said Wayland in a more serious tone. You must have questions. I did. He reached into a small satchel at his side and withdrew a small leather-wrapped knife. Orin took it, flicked the blade an inch out of its sheath, and saw his face reflect in the unmistakable sheen of silver. Wayland patted a similar instrument on his own belt. I see you've been keeping a silvered sword with you for the same purpose. Have any of your friends been forced to use it against you? Orin shook his head. I haven't been with Turkiaha since before this happened, and the hounds know how to deal with such things. He gestured down toward the table, where hunters leapt aside as an unseen presence nipped at their legs. Some of Skull's teeth are silvered too. She's ready to help if it comes to it. Good, Wayland continued. It's a testament to your heroism that you carry your weakness with you at your own risk. There's no reason to throw that sword away, but this skein do will be easier to pocket, and easier for any civilian to wield if they feel threatened. If I threaten them, Orin echoed. He felt tears beginning to brim under his eyes, and choked them back. Wayland let the breeze speak for a moment. Your position isn't an easy one. We isolate ourselves here, so we never have to face the choices you do. It isn't hard to avoid doing harm when everyone is prepared for it, and when there is understanding. But I want you to hear me. He turned to look Orin in the eyes. It is a noble thing you do. Do not shrink back from the world. Whatever you fear, it needs you. Orin nodded solemnly, and made room for Skull as she leapt up the side of the rock, a slight glimmer in her eyes and a collection of food in her jaws. She tossed an apple and a buttered piece of bread onto Orin's lap, and began working on the meat. This has a bite taken out of it, Orin whispered. Skull gave him a lick on the hand and said nothing. If there is anything I can answer immediately for you, I will, Wayland said. Everything else can be discussed in the morning. When you're comfortable, I'd like to see personally what your beast actually is, in a remote place among friends, to get a sense of its capabilities. We'll also see if we can attribute it to an existing clan and find out where you might be from, but that only matters if you decide it does. This is your home, and your future is far more important than your past. Orin settled himself on the rock and flipped the skein dew over in his hand. I suppose I just want to know what the monster wants with me. It wants to take control from you. It's another voice telling you what to do that happens to share your body. You can't get rid of it now that it's taken hold. What you can do, if you want control, is master it. I don't suppose there's any magic for that. No, the process is a bit different for everyone. When I decided a killer's life was not for me, I meditated for hours on end, and I practiced retaining the same mental state while I let the beast out of its cage. Eventually, my will was the only one left. Perhaps you will take the same path, or perhaps you will simply fight its urges until reason asserts itself. Maybe you can befriend it like any other beast, and strike some kind of bargain with it until your goals align. I'm not sure bargains are my specialty. Orin looked up at the chief with a sheepish smile. Perhaps not, he laughed. Despite it all, I'm honestly eager to see how you'll handle it. The beast will hurt people. It will commit cruelties you would never be capable of. But be honest with your friends. Keep that in your pocket. He gestured to the silver dagger. And I have no doubt you'll succeed. Orin slipped the skein dew into place on his belt, and turned to see Ithne climbing up onto the rock. Hati glared up at Skull from below. Not a whole lot of room up here, the huntress observed. Chief, mind if I share Orin for a few minutes? Of course, Captain. He let his head fall onto Derile's side and lay there with her, turning his head to whisper something inaudible into her ear. This probably isn't good, Skull growled quietly. Well then, Ithne tore off a muscle from the leg of goat she wielded and savored it briefly. So why are you really here? A hound of Hulan slumming it in the Highlands with a bunch of witches and gardeners. It's unheard of. She gestured to the weapon at his side and recoiled a bit as she realized it was silvered. What's a nice sword like you doing in a place like this? I'm here to see all of you, Orin said innocently. He took a bite of bread. Oh, the hound's training process must not nearly be as rigorous as the rumors would lead us common folk to believe. Endless battles for a year and a day, is that right? And you're here eating bread. Orin looked down at the bread that remained and found it tasted a little more sour. Well, I took the soonest excuse I could to come home. You must have a mission, then. Ithne leaned closer. Her tone became dark. I hear all sorts of terrifying creatures stalk the Highlands. The sort of things that lowland milk drinkers would take to worrying about and call in their storied warriors to take care of. You wouldn't happen to be on the trail of some sort of creature, would you, friend? Nope, said Skull. Yes, we are, said Orin. Ithne's grin widened. You're still more hunter than hound. What kind of monster do we have on our hands here? Skull gave a rasping sigh and collapsed into Orin's lap. He stuck his hands behind him to balance out the sudden weight. It's supposed to be indescribable. A big rolling ball of fangs and legs with sickle claws, and covered in black fur. They said it has a deadly poison that burns you from the inside out. Would it burn, say, trees and grass? I think so, Orin replied. Then, my good friend Orin, she rose to her feet and stuck out a hand to help him up, I would like to issue you a formal challenge. One which, if you are the honorable barbarian hero the world seems to think you are, you will accept. You don't have to accept, Skull said with a yawn. Remember the rules? No, but I believe you, said Orin. Well, in any case, Ithne continued, frustrated, if you refuse to race me to this quarry of yours, you're going to have to return to Dun Skahach empty-handed. Skull's ears pricked up. That won't do, right? Hunters! Ithne shouted. Waylon sat up as the captain stepped forward to the pinnacle of the rock. Fill your bellies, but save some room for the chase. We have a quarry. Meet me at the gates and we will discuss strategy. Ithne stepped down the rock as she pulled the sling of her crossbow tighter across her back. Well played, coughed Skull as she picked herself up. Orin gave her a surprised look. I don't think I played it very well at all. Chief Waylon lifted himself to a crouch with his spear as Dun Colwood's hunters loaded their arms with what food they could carry and followed their captain to the gates. I wish she would leave this childish rivalry behind. You've chosen different paths, but it will not prove anything to the hounds if you let your friends win. He turned to Darelai. I'm going as well. Will you tend to the pups? Kill quick, she responded. The sun had vanished by the time Orin and Skull found themselves outside the walls of the dun, and winter had begun to feel like itself again. The fort's fire-hardened palisade was clouded by the icy breath of the people and wolves mustered at its base. Chief Waylon stood silently to Orin's right, surrounded by 5 wolves from his pack, all eagerly nipping at one another and sniffing for signs of their prey. To the left stood Ethne, who nodded as the aging hunter passed some insight onto her, and Hati, who turned down from the dark tree line before them only to growl the occasional threat in Skull's direction. Skull appeared to find this delightfully amusing. Everywhere Orin looked, hunters admired their weapons and stretched their tired muscles, eager to begin the hunt. We haven't run with these people in a long time, and I don't really remember how fast they are, he whispered to Skull. Do you think we can actually... You know, came a shout from the left. For all your heroics, you can sort with some interesting characters. Ithne stared at Orin down with a look as though she had just won a bet. She's going to try to get a rise out of you to throw you off, warned Skull. A lot of people down south don't have as high an opinion of your friends as you do, the huntress continued. I don't believe for a second that any one of them would steal a basilisk eye for any reason, Orin stammered. Ithne looked quizzical for a moment. That oddly specific circumstance aside, that's not what I'm talking about. Your white-eyed friend has been seen slaughtering civilians in the lowlands. I don't care much, but it doesn't seem like your style. Orin's eyes widened. That's not possible. Brian could never do that. You should have done your research before deciding to lie about that one, Skull added. White Eyes is in Skavgatar. That's not what the bounties say. She shot Skull a smirk and bent with exaggerated slowness to tighten one of her boots. I'm sure you'll see them soon enough. Should have done your research. Orin looked to Skull for any sign of encouragement. We don't buy this, right? Brian's an ass, but he's never done anything to earn himself a bounty. I'll believe it when I see it. And maybe not even then. Orin turned from the huntress and let out a slow breath. He focused on the warmth of the pommel where his hand had driven away the night air, and turned to the top of the palisade as a bellow echoed over the field. Dressed, stood atop the inner wall, his chest obscured by the tips of stakes. He held an oversized bone carnix aloft that looked like it had been carved in the likeness of some draconic monster. Hunters! It seems I have once again been given the great honor of sending you off while I and the rest of us old bastards hold down the fort here. Start running when this horn blows, and I hope Orin beats all of you by a mile. The crowd had hardly a moment to react before Drest brought the enormous instrument to his lips, and the night was filled with all the sound that the considerable force of the Hearthmaster's lungs could muster. It rang out like a giant's death cry, shaking birds from their perches in the wheeled, sparse canopy, and memories of the horn that had sounded at the Battle of Culloden raced through Orin's mind. He charged the line of autumn trees as though they were an army of frothing orcs, and the rocky field rustled like a swarm of flying insects as leather-clad feet churned the snow on every side of him. He felt a searing heat on his leg, and turned to see Skull keeping pace, looking surprised as red flame fluttered from either side of her half-open jaws like a banner. It didn't so much as singe her fur as tongues of fire broke off and dwindled behind her. "That's new!" he tried to yell before the wind snatched the words away. The two lost track of the sounds of their own footfalls as they left the field and wind behind, tearing through the low boughs that marked the entrance to the wood. The thin trees seemed to hang limply from roots buried deep in the sky, and leaves broke off their branches and made for the ground at the slightest touch. This grove was not as healthy as the one within the dune. Each time Orin's gaze drifted from the white speckled path before him, he caught sight of hunters leaping through the brush, hacking branches aside with blades and parrying them with blows. Anything to keep up with the pack. A hunter called out as she stumbled across a sign of their prey, and Orin veered toward her, cursing himself for forgetting to be on the lookout. As he passed the spot where she had been, he saw a scything cut in a tree that had almost toppled it. Milky poison bled from the wound, searing deep grooves in the bark where it had dripped down the trunk. The snow cover thickened as they left the fires of Dun Callwood behind, and the hunters struggled to gain purchase as they ran. Skull leapt from rock to rock, but it little to keep her from landing in powder-filled valleys when they arose. When it presented a problem, she burned her way through in frustration. Orin noticed the trees beginning to thicken as they crossed deeper into the heart of the weald. There was about a half a mile left, he knew, before they would come to a stretch of open hills, and then to the coniferous forest that bordered the western lake. Vaguely, he sensed that Ithne was ahead of him, cheering on her hunters as they followed the monster's trail. She had a reputation as the fastest in the clan. "Do you have anything for this?" Skull panted. A hunter avoided eye contact as he passed Orin on the left, using a sturdy tree to pull himself along. His footfalls left a path through the snow that Orin gratefully slipped into. "I'm not sure," he answered. "The salmon thing again, maybe?" Orin allowed himself to briefly shut his eyes in concentration as he stepped aside to let Skull into his path. His legs burned with exhaustion, but they felt strong too. The chance for success was invigorating. He was on the chase, and there was a difference between running towards something and running away. He opened his eyes, and immediately he realized how gray everything had been before in the pale red light that outlined his body. Skull glimmered with it too, casting a rosy shadow on the snow she had not yet touched. It lingered only for a moment, and then it left the two in a cloud of little motes of fire, like snowfall drifting up. Orin took a step and found himself flying. The air rushed past him even more intensely before his feet met the ground again, and he readied himself for a greater leap, pushing off the packed snow and into the night. Skull joined him in passing the hunter that had done the same to them moments ago. Together, they pressed the advantage, cresting fallen logs and low branches, and Orin caught sight of another bisected tree, the poison still sizzling in the wound. Waylon hid a smile as they passed him and his pack. Orin leapt to what trees he could and kept moving above the ground, his claws digging into the bark as he made the lunge past Ithne and Hati. The hunter just behind them let out a "Hell yeah!" for which she was quickly rewarded with a spray of snow to the face. Eventually, the trees thinned again, and Orin fell back to the ground rather than risk breaking them. Skull panted up at him with glee. The moon greeted the two across the hills as they gradually left the autumn wood for the natural greens and pale blues of the coastal pine forest. They had long since left behind the commotion of the hunt, and once they entered the wood, Orin leaned against a tree to regain his breath. He knelt and felt the ground, and after a wordless stroke behind Skull's ear, the wolf stood guard beside him. Orin's fingers burrowed deeper beneath the snow until he felt hard ground, and the ice baked into the earth seemed to melt away as magic spread like a warm drink from his chest, and down toward his hand. He felt something, the thing he always felt, pulsing steadily and radiating warmth. He wasn't sure if it was the earth's heartbeat or his own, but he seized it, and suddenly there were points of light in the darkness. Many winked in and out behind him, glowing like stars just beyond the hills, and moving closer. One was up ahead, and moving ever so slightly away. It seemed human, but he couldn't be sure. "I think it's got someone," he told Skull. "Then we can follow it," she said. A glob of liquid fire dripped from her mouth and into the snow as she coughed, burning slowly through each layer of white. Great. Lead on. They're close behind us. That's very cool, by the way. He sighed as he rose to his feet. I kind of wish our friends were here. Sorrel and Andraste could be anywhere, said Skull with a sharp grin. They might be watching us, or eating the rest of the feast as we speak. The evidence of the monster's passage grew more and more obvious as they pressed on. Here, trees had been cut in 2 or even 3 pieces, and great pools of venom as white as the snow melted through it and into the hard earth. Black bristles studded the fallen logs and mingled with the needles shed by the forest, and Skull brushed them out of her fur as best she could. They seemed to stick to everything they touched. Bad news ahead, said Skull. Sure enough, after a few moments the scent of fresh blood wafted over Orin. It would have been even more intoxicating than the feast were it not for his shame. He pulled his cloth up to cover his nose and breathed deeply, hoping to tune out the sanguine fragrance. Slowly his swords slid from their place on his side. He leveled them at shadows as the two inched forward. We must be close. Are you all right? Orin nodded slowly and avoided her gaze. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her slink behind a large fir tree and melt into the darkness. Gradually, the trees parted, and Orin knelt beside a jagged rock to take in the scene. His first horrific thought was that the beast had killed its captive, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw that the flesh and hide strewn about the clearing before him was that of a small deer. His ears picked up more than ever these days, but there was no sound in the air save for that distant crunching of snow under Hunter's boots, and the faint sound of sobbing behind a nearby tree. Orin skirted around the underbrush until he glimpsed the source. A young girl was sitting up against the trunk of pine, her thin arms wrapping her legs tightly to her chest, and crying into her knees. Poison bubbled in pools around her, and the trees were savaged, save for the ones she clung to. Pine needles and bristles littered the forest floor, and cylinders of rough wood were scattered around her tiny form, splintered as though cut with a serrated axe. There was no sign of the beast itself nearby. Cautiously, Orin let the swords fall to his side and rose from his hiding place. The smell of blood assaulted him all over again as he lowered the cloth. He didn't get the chance to speak before the girl noticed him as she peeked through the gap between her fingers. "Oh no," she choked out between sobs. It was almost a sigh. Skull emerged too, and she drew close to the girl. Orin fished for a berry from his satchel, but the wolf narrowed her eyes and shot him a look. "She's unharmed." "Hello," said Orin. Breaking the silence of the forest felt like an act of rebellion. "We're going to help you and stop the monster that did this to you. What's your name?" At the mention of the creature, the girl fell to her knees, breaking the snow cover only slightly. Tears fell from her face and turned to steam on the ground. "No," she said softly, but her voice rose steadily as she spoke. "No, get away. I'm a monster. You'll get hurt." She lashed out with a tiny hand and pushed Skull's face out of the way, and with an unnatural movement lifted herself up on the tips of her toes and into the curvature of the tree. The arch of her spine did not seem human. Orin took a deep breath. He nearly stepped back, but stopped himself. If the girl was anything like him, it would only make it worse. "You can't harm us," he said. "We're warriors. We have, He looked to Skull for guidance, who gave the wolf equivalent of a panicked shrug. "We have, warm blankets and plenty of food if you're hungry." She shook her head fervently, taking her hair in her muddied fingers. Orin stepped toward her. He spoke slowly and calmly, matching the cadence of the wind, as he imagined Wayland might. "I don't think you're a monster." "You don't get it," said the girl. Something in her voice changed, and Orin thought he saw subtle movement behind her cheek and beneath the skin of her throat. "This is a nightmare. How did anyone find me here?" The tears streamed freely, and her voice quivered with desperation. "Go!" A shrill tone cut beneath the shout, and it outlasted her human words. It rang through the forest as the girl let out a final, helpless sob that caught in her throat, and her head lolled back against the tree. Her spine was the first to go. One by one, the bones splintered and broke the skin, jutting out like daggers before black smoke poured from the wounds and obscured them. Her left side erupted, scattering shards of her ribcage as flailing black legs tore into the night air, grasping on the one tree trunk behind her and the ground and forcing the tiny lopsided human body into the snow. Her mouth opened, and she vomited a torrent of sizzling venom onto her already scorched white shift. More legs scrambled out of their prison, one by one, scattering black bristles and smoke and waving sickle blades like swords. Her head, rolling against the ground, snapped into position with a series of sickening pops as feelers burst from her neck and mouth, and Orin saw the plea in her eyes as they rolled back in their sockets and split, following up through the shadow, crawling across her body and bubbling into countless milk-white orbs that betrayed no humanity. The were-spider let out a soundless shriek that shook the entirety of its crooked body, sending bristles and bits of bone out onto the snow, and Orin stepped forward to meet it. "You're not going to kill it, are you?" He could hear the sigh clawing its way into Skull's voice. "No. You're going to stand there and take it until it exhausts itself and hope you can last that long, aren't you?" Orin said nothing. He sheathed his swords and raised his arms to defend himself, turning to the side so that he could use his back to catch blows without losing sight of the beast for too long. Maven had taught him the stance through sparring. She knew how to take hits better than anyone. The spider raised itself. 3 malformed legs braced against a tree and glared at him as venom began to seep from its jaws and coat every inch of its horrifying maw. There was a whistle and an electric hum behind Orin's right ear. The monster threw itself forward, and its chest parted as a burst of blue lightning erupted against its carapace, and a heavy bolt of raw iron impaled it to the tree. Orin yelped in surprise and turned to see Ethne lower her crossbow. She stepped quickly towards him through the snow, Hati just reaching her side, and loaded another bolt. Orin put a hand out before she could pull the sturdy wire into position. Almost instinctively, he stepped between her and the pinned creature. "Wait, Ithne, please." "Too late. I'm just gonna end it here if you can't first." "Wait!" His voice seemed magnified in the quiet of the windswept woods. Ethne finished loading her crossbow with a heavy click. "This is much more complicated than you realize," Skull spat. Hati moved to face her across the clearing, and she forced a derisive smile. "I don't trust a word your fox has to say, Orin." Ethne's voice shook with dwindling patience. "You've got 2 seconds to move aside, or I'll take the shot anyway. I did say we'd spar tonight, after all." "That monster is a little girl," he said, and immediately regretted it as Ethne's face became a mask of confusion. "She's like us." "She's a lycanthrope, and she belongs in Dun Callwood," said Skull. "Classic stuff. Afraid of her power and lost in the woods?" Orin was almost through to her. "How am I supposed to believe you?" She leveled the crossbow at Skull, and Hati took a predator step towards his sister. "It's not about us!" Orin cried. He could see the rage stealing into Ethne's face. For whatever reason, she was losing her composure. "Then let's make it about us." Ethne turned back toward him. Her trademark smirk did its best to reassert itself. "Listen, I don't actually care about your monster. I'm here because I felt like you could use a reminder that I have a right to your quest." Orin stared as she lowered the crossbow and took another step toward him. In the light of the electrical flares arcing off the bolt behind him, he could see a detail on the weapon, its jagged bayonet, the trophies taken from the corpses of countless monsters studding its heavy wood and iron frame. Orin added his trophies to his cloak, because he used it a lot, and he was willing to bet Ethne decorated her weapon for the same reason. The smirk fell from her face, and she became more serious than he had seen her in a long while. "I know you're a nice person, and everyone likes you," she said slowly. "But you burned me when you left." Skull tried to sneak a step closer to Orin, but withdrew her paw at a snarl from Hati. He bared his iron teeth and clawed the ground. "After that druid told you what she did, you and Skull kind of just packed up and went. And I don't know if you thought about what that would mean for everyone else." "If you want to spend more time with us, you could have just said so," Skull teased. Ethne snarled in her direction. Her eyes took on a yellow tinge, and her canines extended into lupine fangs for a brief moment. "No one told me I had a destiny. The chief never groomed me to lead, or filled my head with stories of heroes, and told me I might be up there one day." Her knuckles whitened on the grip of the crossbow. "They told me I was a great hunter, I'm a provider, not a hero. I'm a necessity. I don't get to be celebrated. But there's the trick of it. She took 3 quick steps, and in an instant, she was face to face with Orin, yellow eyes boring into his. You're a great hunter. You would have become captain and done my job just as well as me, and you didn't. You had first choice. So, I stayed and provided for our people while you went out into the world and made a name for yourself. Orin's mouth was dry. The smell of blood was beginning to thicken into something awful in his brain. Then, what do you want? He managed. Ithne's fists shook. I want to be a red stain on the pride of every orc warlord. I want to be the monster they scare their children with. I want my name to sour in their mouths. I want people the next town over to know who I am. She spat down into the snow. And I want you to know that I could have gone gallivanting off with the Chosen of Lugh and his funny little lackeys, and I would have made a damn good hound. Orin froze, and the wind brought silence back to the clearing. The were-spider's chitin creaked as it struggled against its bonds. I'm past wanting to take your place. But I can't sit by and watch while you mope around with Waylon and waste your opportunity. I know you're a full-blooded lycanthrope now. Orin swallowed, and the huntress smiled wickedly. Trust me, you're gonna feel a lot better once you get friendly with all that power boiling in your blood. Her fangs slid back into place, and a foreign light made its way into her narrowing eyes. So I'm gonna teach you, right now. Orin had only a moment to spare before drawing his swords, and he used it to pull up his cloth. The stale smell of herbs he had pressed into it was a blessed release from the sickeningly sweet temptation that reddened the clearing. Ithne let out a fierce cry as she turned the crossbow in the air and cut down with its bayonet, like an axe, and Orin barely got a blade under it to turn it aside in time. She growled and swung again from the side as he brought both blades back to parry. A sliver of iron broke off and sliced his arm on the way to the ground. He gritted his teeth through the pain and was grateful the captain couldn't see it. Ithne paused, only to admire the blow. It bled with surprising intensity, but only for a few seconds before the flesh twitched and curled back up to seal itself whole again. Her smile grew wider. I know you're in there, Orin's beastie, she called. I just have to cut you out. Orin swung wide with one sword and aimed up with a closer swipe as the captain turned to block it. A swift kick sent her back, and immediately she pulled the crossbow up for a shot toward his chest. He barely twisted out of the way as a bolt whistled past, arcing with building electrical energy, and embedded itself with a heavy thud and shower of sparks in the ground a ways away. He wasn't sure which part of the weapon he would rather deal with, but he stepped back and used the time to glance over at Skull. The wolves were locked in their own battle, which Skull looked reluctant to accept on even terms. Hati, the Iron Tooth, had a deserved reputation as a fearsome warrior, and had earned the respect of every wolf but his sister. Here, in a flat clearing, he knew he had the upper hand. His iron jaws gnashed as the smaller wolf ducked out of the way of each blow, searching for weak points with every spare moment. Skull clicked her teeth together in a snarl, and flame emerged, flaring out to the sides. It followed the arc of her leap as she aimed a swift bite to her brother's leg, and tore his footing out from under him, sending embers into the air. Orin moved to warn her as her enemy turned with a claw destined for her head, but a shout brought him back to his own fight as an arcing swing shaved off a section of his cloak. The hunters traded blows as they connected, and Orin saw the blood splash across Ithne's face from her arm, mingling with her woad, before he felt the cut open up on his own chest. He steeled himself against the sting, and sidestepped a swipe at his forehead. Ithne simply pressed forward. It didn't seem to matter that she was holding a bow. The shards of metal on its business end seemed to pierce the air itself as she whirled toward her quarry, a deep snarl welling up from within her, and the iron met Orin's swords one by one like a myriad of ringing bells. "What are you holding back for?" she roared. "Show me what makes you so special. Or are you afraid you aren't?" Orin made one more step between them and lowered the cloth around his mouth. "I'm not!" he shouted, and then Ithne was upon him. "Bad move," she said quietly. The crossbow swung around, trailing bits of hide and feathers, and Orin felt cold metal bite sharply into his side as he stumbled back against a tree. She pushed the blades in further, slicing through the puncture wound they had opened, and her grin turned into a wolfish bite as her fangs extended themselves and she lunged toward his neck. Orin shuddered as the thing inside him let out a low growl. He felt it come up through his own throat, and he bit down hard on the piece of cloth around his neck as every bone in his right arm shattered. The curse crawled out from his heart along the veins in his arm, impossibly fast, wreathing his flesh in shadow up to his fingers, which gave way to slender claws more suited to the monster's purposes that split the skin as they emerged. The sword fell from his grasp as humanity stripped itself from his bones and fell away, and at this, finally, Orin screamed. The claw came up of its own accord, seizing Aithne's neck and stopping her teeth inches from contact. Orin felt his whole body pulled to the left as his right arm threw the captain aside with staggering force, dragging its claws across her throat for good measure and scattering blood across the needles of a nearby conifer. She stumbled back for a few precious seconds, clutching the wound and gasping for breath until it finally sealed, and she regarded Orin with renewed malice through hungry yellow eyes. "All right," she said. "We're out of the gates. Time to push you over the edge." Aithne jabbed at Orin with the crossbow, but pulled back once she had sent him reeling. She gritted her teeth and turned to the side, and her body ruptured beneath the half-cloak she wore. The clothing was overtaken by black fur as she allowed her curse to consume her, and in an instant, there was another black wolf leaping with killing intent towards Skull. She was quick enough to dodge beneath the new threat, but the distraction ensured that Hati's bite found purchase in the scruff of her neck. Orin watched in horror as a huge wolf lifted Skull off the ground and shook her like a doll in his jaws, sending her skidding through the snow with a cruel flick of his neck. There was hardly any resistance from Orin as the beast took hold. He screamed as snapping bones tore his flesh. He fell over onto his already transformed arm, and a wave of shadow coursed out from it, and over his fur and skin, washing over his rapidly expanding chest. His back hunched, the spine grew new bones. His lengthening front limbs pushed him off the ground, and he felt his powerful hind legs bend beneath new weight. Corded muscle snapped into place beneath leathery hide, stretched tight in some places, sagging in others. His eyes burned with fiery light as the monster overtook his face. His scream became a piercing shriek, and a grotesque visage overcame him. Ghostly thin ears swiveled in response to the overwhelming cacophony of sound as his screams sent the activities of every skittering woodland insect back to them. There was a sharp pain in his side, and Orin's silver sword and skein dhu fell to the ground, rejected by his new form. With his last sane thought, he realized that Aithne must not carry one. Orin lifted his upturned nose to the sky and tested his jaw, rotating it horribly and revealing long, hollow fangs to the moonlight. They ached to taste blood, and the captain stood before him. Aithne returned to a form somewhere between elf and wolf. A victorious smile spread like wildfire across her inhuman face. "Now that's what I'm talking about." Orin drove the breath out of her as his claws sunk like blades into her stomach. He pushed off the ground and took her with him, driving her toward the trunk of a fallen tree and pinning her to the dark wood. She laughed as her blood trailed after her before her eyes. "Now I see why everyone's excited." She let out a harsh bark and slashed at his face, but the blow didn't even register in Orin's fractured mind. He tossed her to the left and toward the stump of the sidelong conifer, where a huge deposit of spider venom still burned in the leftover pit. She screamed as the wereback's claws drove her back into the solution. Orin was no longer concerned with the rhythm of fair combat. He struck wood even through her chest with his left claw, and his right came down twice with blinding speed. The first sent gashes through her side that would have killed any mortal warrior. The second opened up her stomach. Aithne stared in shock at the wounds carving themselves across her shadowed form, and Orin's fanged maw descended on her shoulder, bending her spine to the point of breaking over the splintered wood as his mouth filled with warm, red blood. Her eyes widened with fear as he drank his fill, lifted her off the stump that impaled her, and tossed her limply aside. She coughed blood onto the ground, distracted by the burning pain in her back, and began to crawl as her eyes alighted on the depression where the silver blade had sunk into the snow. The monster spit out a chunk of werewolf flesh and resumed its approach. Aithne made 2 impressive lunges across the ground and nearly reached the hilt of Orin's sword before he struck down and sank a wickedly curved claw through her leg. It pulled her back, opening the wound further and dragging her across the cold earth. An enormous shock reverberated against Orin's ribcage as a bolt of black fur and muscle struck his side, and he staggered back in surprise. Some of the fire in his eyes died away, and wounds mended as his massive form shrunk to something more reasonable. The claw released Aethne as his arm shrank slightly. Orin felt relatively human legs quaking below him again, but the wolf didn't stop. Iron sickles sliced through the flesh of his arm as Hati bit down, and he felt the incredible strength of the beast as it yanked him to the ground. The wolf leapt up. Orin felt a heavy pressure on his chest, and through his failing eyes he saw jaws of black iron snapping as they neared his face. He lifted an arm to intercept the blow, but Hati snatched that too, tearing it aside with vengeful force. A claw held Orin down by the neck as the wolf prepared to bite again. Then his head fell onto Orin's heaving chest, and he was dragged off onto the ground. Skull leapt up in his place, her eyes radiating determined purpose, and without hesitation sank her silvered teeth into Orin's shoulder. For what felt like a long while, Orin's world was awash with blinding pain, the likes of which he had never felt before. Pale colors flashed before his eyes, as the woods and the sky vanished beneath the sting of silver. He was drowning and burning all at once, unable to so much as claw his way onto the shore. When the light finally faded, Skull was still shaking him by the shoulder, her eyes closed and speckled with tears, unwilling to let go until the last vestiges of lycanthropy faded away. He raised a hand to the side of her face, relieved to see the shadow pouring out of it like smoke, and she quickly leapt off and turned him over. Orin scrambled to his knees and coughed violently as blood poured from his mouth. He stuffed himself with snow until it was stained red and spit it out onto the forest floor. His eyes watered, but he sat back and breathed deeply of the cool air. "Thanks," he said simply. He reached for Skull with a sad smile and rested a hand behind her ear. "Aethne, I'm so sorry." The captain was sprawled a few feet away, hands clutching her chest as she groaned pitifully. After a while, she choked out a laugh, along with a bit of blood. "Holy shit," she breathed. Hati bristled over her body, casting a venomous glare in every direction. With tremendous effort, Orin reached into his satchel. Numb-fingered, he withdrew a small, red berry, rolled it toward Hati, and turned away. "Hunters are coming," Skull said. "Stay warm." She took the corners of Orin's cloak in her jaws and dragged them over his shivering arms. As his senses returned, Orin too heard the footsteps of approaching hunters and wolves. He saw the stern face of Waylon, along with 3 hunters in his pack, his face a stoic mask as he delegated. He said something urgent that sounded muffled in Orin's ears, and 2 of the hunters moved to apprehend the were-spider, keeping silver daggers at their sides, while the other moved cautiously past Hati to tend to his captain. The chief reached a hand down toward Orin, who took it gratefully. Warmth flooded through him, reminiscent of whenever Brecken offered him a kind word in the midst of the storm. It felt like being in the dun again. Waylon sighed and echoed his smile. "Let's talk a bit more before you return," he said. "Okay."